taken at face value, nor, despite his surface charm and affability, how impenetrable and elusive the president really was. Around this time, the American War Secretary Henry Stimson described how impossible it was to pin Roosevelt down.
His mind does not follow easily a consecutive chain of thought, but he is full of stories and incidents, and hops about in his discussions from suggestion to suggestion, and it is very much like chasing a vagrant beam of sunshine around a vacant room.
But Roosevelt's lack of clarity and commitment was a deliberate cover, sometimes to keep his real intentions secret, sometimes to keep his options open. And his bonhomie was deceptive. Later, Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, would warn Churchill.
When Franklin says yes, 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 it doesn't mean he's agreeing, it means he's listening.
But as yet, Churchill realized very little of this, and could only proceed on the basis of what he saw and heard. That continued to be encouraging. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Bill. Roosevelt followed up with a rip-roaring speech.
The British people need tanks and guns and ammunition and supplies of all kinds. From America they will get tanks and guns and ammunition and supplies of all kinds.
In the audience was the new British ambassador to Washington, Lord Halifax. He felt there could only be one interpretation of Roosevelt's words.
March the 16th, 1941. Certainly no such speech has ever been made by the head of a state not at war, without putting it into war.
But those who knew Roosevelt best sensed that he was playing a double game with Churchill. After a private meeting with him, his Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau noted in his diary,
"I may be mistaken, but I don't think that the President has in mind to do anything very dramatic to help England at this time."
There was one immediate test of how far Roosevelt was willing to go. Lend-Lease could only work if supplies were shipped safely across the Atlantic. Some in Roosevelt's cabinet privately urged him to allow American ships to form armed convoys. Roosevelt rebuffed them.
April 2nd, 1941. The President said that public opinion was not yet ready for the United States to convoy ships. This was his whole attitude anyway, that he seemed to be still waiting and not ready to go ahead on all-out aid for England.
It was the first sign of backsliding, and not the attitude of a man who intended to give his people a firm lead. For Churchill, it could not have come at a worse time. He was entering his darkest period of the war. In April, Hitler's armies smashed Yugoslavia and Greece. The Germans seemed invincible. Rommel was driving the British Eighth Army out of Libya. The U-boat toll on British shipping in the Atlantic was rising. And Roosevelt, in the view of several of his most senior cabinet members, was retreating on his commitment to support the British.
21st April 1941. I found everybody rather discouraged by the war news and by the fact that the President doesn't seem to be keeping his leadership in regard to the matter. I cautioned him on the necessity of his taking the lead.
Roosevelt made one move. He allowed the American Navy and Air Force to patrol further into the Western Atlantic. But this gave only small extra protection to the shipping lanes between Britain and America, and was little use against the Hitler, who now controlled most of Europe and was threatening the whole of the Middle East and India beyond. Churchill pleaded with Roosevelt for more help to stop the Nazis.
At this moment, much hangs in the balance. I feel Hitler may quite easily now gain vast advantages very cheaply, and we are so fully engaged that we can do little or nothing to stop his spreading himself.
Roosevelt's reply shocked Churchill. The president appeared not to see what he was fussing about.
Personally, I am not downcast by more spread of Germany for additional large territories. There is little of raw materials in all of them put together, not enough to maintain nor compensate for huge occupation forces.
For Churchill, Roosevelt's message revealed a devastating truth. It showed that the president simply didn't care about the Middle East. Viewing it as part of an outdated empire, he preferred the British to do without. What mattered to him was supplying Britain through the Atlantic in order to keep Hitler away from America. The next day, May the 2nd, Churchill toured the bombed city of Plymouth. In public, he was keeping his chin up. But Hitler's destruction and Roosevelt's message had pitched him to rock bottom.
Friday, May the 2nd, 1941. The PM, in worse gloom than I have ever seen him, dictated a telegram to the President drawing a somber picture of what a collapse in the Middle East would entail. Then he sketched a world in which Hitler dominated all Europe, Asia and Africa and left the US and ourselves no option but an unwilling peace.
In desperation, Churchill told Roosevelt he must come to his rescue.
Mr. President, the one decisive counterweight I can see would be if the United States were immediately to range herself with us as a belligerent power.
It was a year since Churchill had become Prime Minister, and he was back to square one, on bended knees to Roosevelt, begging him to join the fight, threatening disaster if he didn't. The evasiveness of the man on whom he had pinned everything was dashing all his hopes. In May 1941, Winston Churchill was at his lowest ebb. It seemed President Roosevelt was letting him wither on the vine. He minuted his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden.
It seems to me as if there has been a considerable recession across the Atlantic, and that quite unconsciously we are being left very much to our fate.
It was not just Churchill who was in despair. In Washington, several of Roosevelt's most senior cabinet members were in mutinous mood at the president's apparent inertia. On May the 12th, 1941, the Interior Secretary, Harold Ickes, organized a secret meeting with the War Secretary, Henry Stimson, the Attorney General, Bob Jackson, and the Navy Secretary, Frank Knox. Ickes noted in his diary,
I had called this meeting to see to what extent the men mentioned would be willing to join in some written representation to the President. All of us found ourselves in complete agreement. None of us could account for the President's failure of leadership.
2 days later, another senior cabinet member, the Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, recorded in his diary a meeting with Harry Hopkins, the man closest to Roosevelt.
Hopkins said the president has never said so in so many words, but he thinks the president is loath to get us into this war, and he would rather follow public opinion than lead it.
At this pivotal moment, Roosevelt appeared to suffer some form of psychological crisis. Pressured by the small but still vocal minority of isolationists on one side, and the hawks in his cabinet on the other, he spent much of May 1941 in bed, and rarely went to the office. He had a mild cold, but was not otherwise